What does it mean that the Australian government isn't ceded? The term ceded means formally given over through a treaty or agreement. In Australia, the British Crown never signed a treaty with the First Nations peoples. Therefore, in the eyes of many, including Indigenous sovereignty movements, Australia is an unceded territory. The land was never legally or morally transferred to the Crown. The High Court of Australia, Mabo Decision 1992, acknowledged that terra nullius was a lie, but the government still claims sovereignty by occupation, which is legally shaky under international law. Does this mean we can resist or take back the land? Here's the honest answer. International law says, yes, peoples under colonial domination or alien occupation have the right to resist, including by force if necessary. Geneva Protocol 1's Article 1(4). First Nations in Australia have a right to self-determination. Under international law, the original sovereigns, First Nations peoples, never ceded sovereignty, so they retain the right to resist to self-determination and to independence if they choose. This could, in theory, include reclaiming land and resources. But Australian law, the system in power, says no, the government does not recognize a legal right to resist. In fact, it criminalizes sedition, insurrection, and resistance as treason or terrorism. If you try to resist violently, you can be arrested, charged, and punished under Australian criminal law, even though international law might support your cause. The dilemma. International law says yes, especially for First Nations. Australian law says no under the Crown system. Moral law says yes. If a government is truly tyrannical, oppressive, or occupying by force, resistance is a last resort. But nonviolent resistance, education, and building community power are usually safer and more effective. So can we do this? If by we you mean all Australians, it's a complex issue. The right of resistance under international law primarily applies to those under occupation or colonial domination, First Nations peoples in Australia. If by we you mean First Nations communities, the legal and moral argument for resistance is much stronger. For non-Indigenous Australians who support Indigenous sovereignty, allyship, education, and nonviolent activism are key. Final word. While the law of the land, Australia's legal system, says no, the law of the world, international law and human rights, says the people have a right to resist tyranny and occupation. But if you resist directly, you risk arrest and prosecution. That's the brutal truth. It's why nonviolent resistance, mass movements, and international pressure are often safer paths.